okay? So I want you to see that this is where we are, right here, okay? Now, we're going to first travel all the way across the ocean to this little island right here, and this is where Helen grew up, okay, in England. Now, we're going to go down, 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 down to the great big continent of Africa. Towards the center is the Congo, and this is where Helen served as a missionary. Now, another fun thing, you guys, you're going to learn about a ministry in Albania, where we're going to be raising money and sending it. That was over here, okay? So pretty neat. If you think about Helen, you'll kind of think about Albania here. Now, even though tomorrow you guys are going to hear all about Helen's amazing travels from England, where she was born, all the way to the Congo, today I want to tell you guys all about Helen's life before the Congo. What was she doing when she was your age? And what was she doing when she was a little bit older? Now, as I said, Helen was born in England, and her parents went to church every week. That was a normal part of their life. But their church was very different from our church, okay? Because Helen's parents did not actually go to church because they loved Jesus or because they had any kind of a relationship with him personally. They went to church because that was just the right thing to do. And so Helen grew up thinking that that was the right thing to do, and she grew up knowing a lot about God, hearing a lot about God, but at the same time not knowing God and feeling far from him. And maybe you guys feel the same way. Maybe some of you in this room, you go to church every week because your parents say that's the right thing to do, and they're right, okay? And you might even know a lot about the Bible, and you might be able to raise your hand and answer all kinds of questions in class, but you don't really have any kind of personal connection to Jesus. Maybe you feel far from Jesus. And if that's you, then guys, you have a lot in common with Helen when she was younger. Now, when she was 8 years old, even though Helen was not a Christian, God gave Helen a very special desire. Raise your hand if you have a brother or sister who's 8 years old. Yeah, some of you guys do, okay? That's really close. All right, so when Helen, on her 8th birthday actually, she was in a Sunday school class, and her teacher was teaching them all about the country of India, which was just, to Helen, a far-away country. But in that moment, Helen had this big desire to travel to far-away places and tell people about Jesus. And so even at that age, God gave her a desire to be a missionary. Have you guys ever thought about being a missionary? Wow, that's amazing. God can give you that desire at any age. All right? Now, when Helen was a little bit older, when she was 12 years old, she went to a boarding school, which was where she was going to learn. It's like school, but she would live there, and she lived there with a bunch of other girls. It was an all-girls school. And Helen was really smart, and she was really motivated. She liked to do hard work, and so she would do really well in her classes, but Helen was also a little bit of a wild child, you guys. She could get into trouble sometimes. One time, do you want to hear a story about something she did? Oh, I'll skip it then. Oh, you do want to hear the story. Okay. One time, Helen thought it would be a good idea if some of the other girls in her pretended that there was a fire down in the basement of the school. And she said, girls, watch me, and I'll show you how we can escape to safety. So think about the gym that you were in where you all did music together. That's big, isn't it? So what Helen did is she climbed out a window at the top of the gym, and she landed her foot on some roof tiles, and she crept really quietly across the sewing room windows so no one would see her. And then she found a drain pipe, and she put her arms and her legs around it, and she slid down the drain pipe and landed on another roof to the music room. And the girls, they were giggling and watching her, and they thought it was so fun. But guess who else was watching her? It's like the headmistress, like the principal of the school. And she got in trouble. But Helen really, really wanted to be a good influence. She knew that she could get a lot of attention, and she liked that. But the problem was she didn't know how to be a good influence. And maybe that's like you, right? Maybe you like to have attention. You like when other kids watch you, and you're really good at being funny and getting lots of attention. And you'd like to be a good example, but you kind of don't know how. And the truth is, guys, without Jesus and without the Holy Spirit, none of us know how to live and be a really good example. Now, when Helen was a teenager, something really scary was happening in her life. Okay? Helen was living during the time of World War II, which was a time when there was fighting going on around where she lived, and there were actually things happening called air raids. And an air raid is when planes fly overhead and they drop bombs. And one of the places this was happening was a town called London. Now, where she was going to school was called Wales, and that was about a 3.5-hour drive to where her home was in England. And so sometimes Helen would be on a train or on a bus, and she would have to go through London as she went back and forth from her boarding school to home. And London was a place that was getting a lot of these air raids at that time. And so she would drive past these broken down, blown up buildings and see people in the streets just not dressed well. And that was scary for Helen. And there would even be air raids happening while she was traveling sometimes. And the air raids would go off, and you know what they would tell everybody? They would tell everybody, get ready, planes with bombs are coming, and they're going to fall where you are. And so the people would have to try to run and hide. And this was terrifying. And so Helen, she had already been searching for God as a little girl. And now as a teenager, she's searching for God even more. Because she thinks, well, there has to be someone who's bigger than me. And there has to be someone who's bigger than the war and can help me understand what all of this means. So she kept looking for God, and she did that really in the only way that Helen knew how to look for God, and she just kept going to church, and she would do the things that girls her age did at church. If there was a ceremony that she needed to do, some sort of thing to perform, that's what she would do, and she thought, surely doing all of these things will help me get close to God. But you know what? None of those things did help her get close to God, because the truth is, nothing that you do, nothing that you perform, no amount of knowledge in your head is going to get you close to the Lord. Helen was looking in all the wrong places. Now, as Helen got older, she ended up leaving boarding school and decided to go to Cambridge University, where she was going to study to become a doctor. All right? Now, this is a beautiful place, but for Helen, it was a lonely place. Raise your hand if you have ever moved to a totally new place before. Yeah, I bet a lot of you have moved to a totally new place before. And so, tell me that. And so, Helen moved to a totally new place. She went from a boarding school where all these girls knew her, and she knew all these girls, to this beautiful university with a bunch of people she didn't know and who didn't know her. But the first night that she was there getting settled into her new home, she saw a note that had been left for her. And the note said, if you don't know anyone and have nowhere to go after supper, come and have coffee in my room, number 12, at 8 p.m., and it was signed Dorothy. So Helen thought, yes, I'm going to go to Dorothy's room because I am all alone. And that night, Helen went, and she met Dot. That was her nickname. And she met 7 other girlfriends, and they laughed, and they talked, and they ate snacks and had special drinks. Do you guys like to eat snacks and have special drinks? Me too. I would instantly feel better with snacks and special drinks. So she became friends with these girls, and Dot especially became a good friend to her. She even showed up the next morning and took her to breakfast and showed her around the town and showed her around the school and did all kinds of things for her. And Dot did something else for her that was very special. she started taking her to Christian meetings with her, where she was starting to learn about the Jesus of the Bible that had seemed so far from her before. And these new friends of Dot's, they seemed really different to her. These girls were super nice, super friendly. They didn't use any bad language. They never lied, right? These girls loved reading their Bibles, and then they actually did what it said in the Bibles. They lived like they really believed all of this stuff. And to Helen, growing up in the church she went to, well, the Bible was just some stuffy old book with some stuffy old stories. It didn't really mean anything to her life. So she was so encouraged by these girls that she started to read her Bible, and she started to read it with them and on her own, and she got really excited about reading it. Now, as Christmas approached, some sad news came to Helen. Her parents said, "You can't come home for Christmas." Her sister, one of her sisters, was very, very sick, and it was dangerous for Helen, because if she would have gotten really sick, it could have really hurt her. She had been really sick as a little kid lots of times, so she had to stay. And so some of her friends said, "Well, why don't you come home with us? And then, after a couple weeks, we're all going to a special Bible camp at a Bible college. Do you want to come with us?" And Helen said, "Yeah, I'd love to go." And so she went. But during camp, Helen was struggling, right? She's been looking for God this whole time. Now she's at this camp where she's learning about God, but she's still confused. Why do these other girls read their Bibles and have a changed heart and behave differently? And I read my Bible, and I'm just still the same. I try so hard to be good, but I keep messing up. I keep failing. And so one night, one of the girls said, "Why don't we study the book of Romans together?" And they all liked that idea, and Helen thought that was a great idea too. Let's study the book of Romans, which is a book in the New Testament. It's great, great book. And so they all studied it, and Helen got so sucked into the Bible and the verses and the questions that she didn't even realize she had stayed up all night studying her Bible. She never went to sleep. She was up in the morning still. And so she was taking in all this information and loving it and still kind of trying to wrestle with what it all meant. And so one night, Helen is all alone in her bedroom, and she looks and she sees a poster on the wall. And the poster has Psalm 46:10 on it, which says, "Be still and know that I am God." And that was a big deal for Helen, because Helen was always trying, always moving, always on the go, always trying to be good enough. And this said, "Be still and know that I am God." And it was that night that God opened Helen's eyes to the truth of the biblical gospel. Helen finally understood that Jesus Christ had lived a perfect life for her because she couldn't. She understood that Jesus Christ died for her personally and for her sins that she had committed. He died the death she deserved. And Helen understood that Jesus Christ rose from the dead because he's way more powerful than death, and he is way more powerful than sin, and he is the only one who can defeat her sin. And so that night, Helen Roseveare repented and put her faith in Jesus Christ. And you know what? When she went back downstairs, the other girls, they said, "Helen, what happened to you? You look different." Because Helen had the joy and the peace of becoming a new creation on her face even, that the girls recognized it. And so this was such an exciting time for Helen. She was loving knowing more about God. She just loved Jesus so much, and she had all these friends around her. But as she kept learning in medical school, there was a point where she no longer stayed doing what she was doing at Cambridge. Now she was supposed to work in an actual hospital. That was what came next in her studies. And so she went to West London Hospital. And it was really hard because suddenly she lost all these wonderful people who had been helping her to grow as a Christian. So it was a really hard time for her, but she still focused on the fact that Jesus loved her and she wanted to share that love with other people. So she got permission to hold a special service for her patients. And she would take an instrument like this called a harmonium, and she would play some music, sing some songs, and tell them the gospel. And she did it for 3 years, you guys. 3 years she did that. That's a long time, isn't it? And at the end of those 3 years, she saw people respond to the gospel and get saved like she had gotten saved. But all throughout that time, she still felt lonely. And she still was just struggling with that loneliness and discouragement. So one night a friend of hers invited her to go see a movie. And it was a special movie all about a missionary. And she loved it. She loved it so much that she stayed late to talk to the guy who filmed the whole movie. And he said, you know what, I think you should come to my missionary organization and come check it out. And so she did. She went and visited what was known as the WEC. And she loved it so much that she ended up living there while she finished studying at Cambridge. And one of the things that she was responsible for doing while she was living there was taking care of this woman, Edith Mules. Now, Edith was the very first medical missionary that WEC had ever sent to Africa. And she was such a faithful woman that even in her last 6 weeks of life, where she couldn't even get out of a bed, she just was in her bed all the time. Even from her bed, she would train other nurses to be missionaries, and she would write letters to encourage the missionaries that were in Africa at that time. And Helen had no idea how much of an impact this woman would make on her future mission work. Now, eventually, Helen was able to pass all her classes, and that meant that she was now Dr. Helen Roseveare. That was so exciting. And she had begun to think that God was going to use her skills as a doctor to be a medical missionary. And so she decided to stay at the WEC, not just as a student who lived there, but as a missionary training candidate. But this meant now that Helen had some special responsibilities. Helen had to chip in with the housework. Raise your hand if you do chores at home. Oh, good. Lots of you do chores. That's really good. Now, you might think this is silly, but even though Helen was a grown woman, she had never done any chores. She just didn't know how to do housework. So she had to learn how to clean bathrooms and how to do laundry. And she made some mistakes. She dyed everybody's clothes green. Could you imagine?
What does that mean?
It means that she did everybody's laundry, and when it was all done, everybody's clothes were green. She had accidentally put some green socks in that didn't belong there. And so everybody's clothes turned green, and then those socks she put in there, well, they ended up white and the size of like little baby socks. So she didn't really know what she was doing, but she had a good sense of humor, and she kept on learning. And she worked towards becoming this medical missionary, but she didn't exactly know yet where she was going to go. But that changed one day when she was walking past a calendar and saw a specific verse on that calendar. The verse said, "Repair the house of the Lord." And for some reason, Helen thought that was important for her, and she tore off that piece of paper, and she kept that verse with her, and she prayed to the Lord to try to understand why that was important to her. And that was on a Tuesday. Now, a few days later, on Friday, so Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, okay, she was sitting for a prayer meeting, and the leader pulled out a piece of paper and opened it and read the same verse from the same day of the calendar. And they said, "I think this is something we need to pray about, and I think we need to pray specifically about the Congo." Because the Congo was one of their oldest missionary stations. They had been there for 30 years, but yet they had never been able to send a doctor. And they said, the leader said, "I think to repair the house of the Lord for the church in Congo means to send them a doctor. We need to pray that we can send a doctor." And Helen thought, "Oh, God, I think you're telling me I'm that doctor." So she kept praying. And then a few days later on Sunday, she was reading her Bible again, and another verse popped out that really affirmed for Helen that was what she was supposed to do. So she was preparing to go be the doctor for the Congolese people. But before she graduated her missionary training and was able to go, she took a camping trip in northern England. Raise your hand if you like to camp. We've got some campers in here. Yeah. She liked to camp too. And she went and camped at this beautiful hillside. Oh, sorry, guys. We're getting there. There we go. This beautiful hillside that looked something like this in northern England. It had this beautiful heather growing, and she sat there, and she looked up at the clouds, and that day she made a commitment to the Lord. And it's really important. I want you guys to hear it because it's going to be so important as we keep learning about Helen. This is how she tells the story. She says, afterwards, I went up into the mountains and had it out with God. Okay, God, today I mean it. Go ahead and make me more like Jesus, whatever the cost. But please, when I feel I can't stand anymore and cry out, stop, will you ignore my stop and remember that today I said, go ahead? And guys, God did make Helen more like Jesus. And sometimes it cost Helen a lot. So come back tomorrow and hear the second part of our story to see exactly how God did that.